As they search for how women can work, of course, they interrupt like this: the Ottoman First World War, then the War of Independence. If these wars had not happened, maybe the first wave feminism would have settled in Turkey. But what do women do with wars anyway? They establish associations, go to embassies to help the army, protest in front of embassies, write letters. In other words, they also go into an extraordinary state of mobilization during war. In other words, they are not concerned with defending women's rights. They are concerned with defending the homeland.
Hello everyone from Istanbul School. Dear viewers, today we will talk about women's issues as a historical and social problem area. Our guest is Dr. Hidayet Şefkatli Tuksal. Welcome, teacher.
I liked it.
How are you?
Thank God I'm fine.
Professor, today we want to talk to you about the women's issue. I mean, it has been talked about for years, maybe centuries, but we want to talk to you again. How did this women's issue begin, both in the world and in the Ottoman Empire, and how did it come to us? Can you tell us a little about these? Of course.
In fact, the issue of women has always been discussed in the world. Because we see that in ancient Greece, femininity and masculinity were defined. Arrangements were made accordingly. It's like this in Rome. Times change, but these arrangements continue more or less the same way. In other words, a system where the man is always at the center and women, children, slaves, servants surround this man's world and are positioned according to the man. We call it a horse-centered system. Not only is practical life established in this way, but the language, lifestyle, and system of thought are formed accordingly. Therefore, when it comes to human, for example, it is very natural to understand a man first, because the human species is represented by men. Everything else is like an extension or complement of men. This has negative effects on women's lives. Women talk about these. For example, if we give an example from our own history, various narrations emerge while Aisha was still alive. If a man, woman, donkey, or dog passes in front of a person who is praying, his prayer is invalidated. Of course, when it reached Aisha's ears, she was very uncomfortable. What are you saying? He says you equate women with donkeys and dogs. There are various objections. That were conveyed from her. For example, you are already a nation that considers women bad. That's why you say these things. When the Prophet was praying, I would lie down in front of him and he would prostrate towards my feet. When he would prostrate, I would pull my feet away. After getting up from prostration, I would extend it again. I experienced this. How can you make up such a thing, he says, or other narrations? When women reach out to something or in situations that make them uncomfortable, if they are able to talk, they do. But women are not always able to talk.
Unfortunately.
Yes, there is a price for speaking. In other words, Hazrat Aisha is actually a person who paid the price for this. For example, why is Hazrat Fatima always shown as a model woman in our history, a person who passed away at a young age? And especially in the Sunni things that are attributed to her, the things attributed to Hazrat Fatima are very moderate. In other words, the model of Fatima, who could not even have a helper in her house despite being the daughter of the Prophet, who had to do all those difficult tasks herself with her young and weak children, and who was the wife of a hero, the daughter of a hero, presents a very acceptable model of womanhood in the Sunni community. For example, Hazrat Aisha is not such an acceptable model of womanhood, but Fatma is an acceptable model of womanhood. But when you look at Shiite literature, Hazrat Fatima is actually a symbol of rebellion. They also elevate her to the position of an acceptable woman in that respect.
Those who defend their rights are not seen as acceptable anyway. It still seems that way, sir.
I mean against the authorities. So the authorities create a comfort zone for themselves. Any kind of dominant group has such a comfort zone. In this comfort zone, they want no one to object. When there is, of course, problems arise. It's like this in the world too. In the past, Christian women have also spoken out. For example, because Christianity has this monastic tradition, because it is widespread, because Christianity, the ideal Christianity, not to deal with the world and nothing, to be engaged only in worship and waiting for this life to end. So the women in this convent, but because they learned to read and write, because they could deal with religious sources, they had the power to interpret religion at that time. And they also had such mystic women. They were influential for a while, but in the later period, they were also more suppressed. But here comes the day the tide turns, when the power of the church starts to wane, when the power of the aristocracy starts to wane in the West, and when a new bourgeois class, that is, a class that rises by earning money and becomes a class, starts to emerge, the decrease in the power of these other two things causes something. People start to come up with ideas for this in this new situation. How will we be governed? How will we organize life? I mean, a lot of philosophers emerge at that time. Ultimately, this enables the issue of women to come to the agenda. How does it enable it? After the French Revolution, the Declaration of Human Rights was published. This Declaration of Human Rights is a beautiful thing. It says that every human being has natural rights and so on. But this has always been the case in French, because it is a language, a gendered language. It has been expressed through the male gender. When women read this declaration, Olympia Gauche rewrites this declaration with female gender pronouns. Thus, for the first time, a declaration of women's human rights emerges. But of course, this creates a bit of confusion.
Something is emerging that women are human too.
Yes, I mean, when we look at the debates at that time, I'm really surprised. You know, the debates we have today in conservative circles, the same debates were going on in France at that time. For example, I think it was Proudhon, the famous utopian socialist, or was it you? Proudhon, I mean, he says, how can a woman say that she wants the right to be elected? How he says now her husband will vote for another party, she will vote for another party. Can such a thing happen? She says this is a great shame for her husband. How can a woman come out and speak in front of so many men? So these were spoken of in the French of that time. So these changes are always painful. But once they start, they continue. There is Olympia de Gauche, the movement of friends or other women. In England, again, the books written by women, the claims made about women, the discussions questioning the acceptances, the first book written to justify women's rights. These are always controversial things. Thus, they start to be discussed.
And then the first wave women's movements actually emerge along with these?
Yes, these are the developments that prepare. This creates a discussion environment. Then it spreads slowly. Women adopt these. Of course, women also start to become stronger in some way. In other words, accessing information sources is a means of empowerment. In other words, being able to read and write, being able to make your voice heard somewhere is an important thing.
So what were the main demands of this movement? What did women basically want?
Basically, they want this. We are human beings like men. You treat us like children because you only want us to be raised like this. The famous philosophers or clergymen of that time, the daughters of these people will be mothers. In other words, they should have the skills that will please a man. They should learn to adorn themselves and become beautiful. They should learn to raise children, although women did not look after children in Europe at that time. In our Ottoman Empire, women of rich families did not have the opportunity to look after children. In other words, maids or nannies generally look after children. But there is still such a discourse that they should learn to be mothers and companions. In other words, they do not need to learn anything more. But on the one hand, they say this. On the other hand, they constantly belittle women as beings who are concerned with adornment and adornment, who are unaware of the world. This is what the objections they receive say. They say, women, we also want the right to education. We also want to be educated. Yes, why are women like this? Because this is how they are raised. If this style changes, women will start to think, they will start to care, they will be more knowledgeable. Not only that, there is also the problem of property in the West. Women generally cannot own property. Inheritance usually transfers wealth to the oldest brother, and women do not have the right to work. Therefore, they cannot claim custody of their children when there is a dispute regarding their right to education or property. Gradually, they start to claim that they should have the same rights as men. Various events are already taking place, various lawsuits are taking place, and organizations are also taking place. For example, the story of women demanding the right to vote and be elected in England is completely about 2 films today about these fragile characters. In other words, the struggles that some women put their lives on the line are won in this way.
So how did it reflect on Muslim countries? How do you see this?
It is reflected in Muslim countries almost simultaneously. In fact, this is not only reflected in women as students. Let's say that when the Ottoman Empire started to suffer its first defeats, its serious defeats, and realized that something was changing in the world, that there was an increasingly powerful group of enemy states against it, they started to panic seriously. How can we compensate for this? First, they started to strengthen and renew themselves militarily, but while doing this, they also entered the West. Envoys were sent, people went and came, they saw what was going on here, they wrote down their impressions, etc. Something like this emerges, a discourse like this emerges, including Namik Kemal. So we are falling behind, our homeland is in danger because we are an ignorant nation, because our mothers are ignorant, our women are ignorant, they cannot raise their children well because they are ignorant. Therefore, we have a problem with qualified people. In order to eliminate this, we must definitely educate our women. This is becoming a very serious discourse. And women are also embracing this discourse. They say, yes, in order to raise good generations, we need to be educated, we need to develop. And so we see a women's movement, claims, developments, etc. That started and then continued to increase.
Well, I am telling you what kind of success these methods achieved, what kind of results the protests or actions achieved as a result of the situations in which they took place for that period.
So we don't see a lot of protest actions in the Ottoman Empire. They were more informative and awakening. In other words, by holding meetings, especially by writing, which was not very common until that day. First, they write in magazines published by men, or magazines started to be published for women. Men write under women's names, but over time, newspapers and magazines entirely written by women started to appear. They start writing books, they start writing novels. In other words, women begin to enter what we can call the literary public or the political public by writing and expressing their views there. For example, when Fatma Aliye translated a novel from French, nobody believed that it was translated by a woman at first. It was discussed in the newspapers that this is an obscure name or something like that. Actually, there is no name. There is only a statement that she is a woman. Anyway, all these developments, even Fatma Aliye's writing adventure, in fact, her father was a pasha, there were teachers at home and so on, but her husband did not allow her to write anything for about 6 years after her marriage. She only started writing after her husband gave her permission. But in the end, she writes in newspapers and publishes books. She became one of the famous names of that period. And she becomes a figure in the women's movement, a figure that we cannot call a feminist, but a figure that defends women's rights in a line that is more conservative on certain issues, in a line that we can call nationalist, sacredist. But there are more modernist, more feminist writers than her. So let's put it this way. Maybe the most fundamental characteristic of the Ottoman women's movement is that it always took religion into account, in line with the Western movement, when making demands, criticisms, objections. In other words, religion is always taken into account. It is not done in a secular way. In other words, religion is not put to one side. Evidence is sought from within religion. Wrong interpretations of religion are emphasized. Why is it misinterpreted? Why did it happen that way? Why is it like this? As a result, there is a lot of discussion and debate, and ordinary women also participate in this. Can you imagine? The Women's World magazine of those days had 5,000 subscribers. This was in Ottoman lands. There was also a women's movement in Egypt. There was also a women's movement in Crimea. In other words, there was a movement in every Muslim geography where enlightenment was reflected in some way. Therefore, both male intellectuals participated in these discussions and supported women, and the palace actually supported women. For example, the support of the palace was that a tremendous schooling activity began. In other words, many schools were opened where girls could receive education, teachers' schools were opened, books were written for them, curricula were prepared. In fact, one of the books written for them was a work called Mesahirun Nisa by Mehmet Zini Efendi. It was 2 volumes. It was famous throughout history. It talked about women. Think about why this book was written. I mean, girls will be trained in teacher schools. Let them see that there were many women like this in history. Let them take an example from them so that they can gain self-confidence. In other words, all of these things turn into something that nourishes women and really supports the women's movement. But there are also different colors within the women's movement. I mean, there are those who are more religious, there are those who are more positivist, but they demand women's rights. I mean, they demand education, property, full first wave style education, property, politics, work rights, all of these. And they demand these by bringing evidence from religion.
In fact, the situation where women were left behind was also done based on religion. They are trying to base the struggle that emerged with these women's movements on religion. It does not seem possible to continue in Muslim societies without basing it on religion. They are looking for a basis, a guarantee. While continuing the dominance of men over these women, they are trying to do so with evidence based on religion. Here they are providing themselves with a guarantee. But on the contrary, when these women's movements become active, they are actually providing support for themselves from a different perspective by interpreting religion in a different way or by seeing it in a more enlightened way.
Of course, because religion is a common legitimating force at that time. For women and men, everyone tries to derive their legitimacy from there. Therefore, women also use this method. Sometimes they may overinterpret, but no matter what, there are also women who act more secularly. For example, the word feminist has been used since those times, and there are discussions. There are men who get very angry about this. We have male writers. Where did this word come from? What is this, etc.? Just like today, just like today, just like today. They say, you took the railway, you took the word automobile, you took this and that. You don't see any harm in these. I mean, why do you have a problem with the word feminism when it is taken from the West? Or why do you have a problem when women want their rights? Aren't we human? Look at our lives. When women are better educated and more involved in social life, your life will not get worse. In fact, we will all develop together. These gentlemen are trying to convince themselves by saying that our conditions will be better. But some women's groups are now saying that they don't care whether you are convinced or not. We will continue on your path. There are also women who continue in this mode. So there is such a spectrum then.
How successful were these movements when we saw them at that time?
Well, of course, we don't know if they were able to reach the villages. I mean, 5,000 subscribers was a pretty good number in the conditions of that day. And the most important feature of these magazines, these women's newspapers, is that they are fed a lot by the letters of their readers. So they don't only write themselves, they receive the voices of marginalized women through those letters and make them heard. Thus, there is an interactive interaction. Therefore, when we look at those letters, we see that they are particularly effective in this respect. Now, women are aware that they are being persecuted. I mean, I am saying this based on a letter. I mean, they are aware of this psychology of being constantly humiliated by their husbands, such as, why this button is broken, why didn't you do this, why didn't you do that, why didn't you do this, why didn't you do that? Or when they are reading the newspaper and he asks what is in the newspaper, you don't understand, these are national issues and so on, but they don't know what they can do against it. Now, if this psychology is displayed in the newspapers, if it is judged, if it is named that this is not a normal situation but a form of oppression.
They can't call it psychological violence, so they keep pulling and pulling.
Yes, at that time, psychological violence, etc., was the most natural right of men. I mean, everyone was a king at home. After all, of course, this is something that disturbs men's comfort a lot. But despite this, there was such a consensus among the palace, the ruling elite and the literate class of that period that we had to go beyond this level and become a more equal, more civilized society in quotation marks. In other words, there was a significant segment that found these revelations, criticisms and objections of women justified and produced answers to this by opening schools, searching for how women could work. But of course, the Ottoman Empire was interrupted by the First World War, followed by the War of Independence. If these wars had not happened, maybe first-wave feminism would have settled in Turkey. But what do women do with wars anyway? They establish associations to help the army, they go to embassies, they protest in front of embassies, they write letters. In times of war, they too are now entering an extraordinary state of mobilization. In other words, they are concerned with defending the homeland rather than defending women's rights.
So maybe they are putting this in the background because they are faced with a bigger problem.
Yes, in a way, yes. We see that almost all women of that period adopted that mobilization personality.
I was going to ask exactly this. What were the biggest challenges they faced? It varies depending on the region and the situation. Maybe in the Ottoman Empire in these wars, maybe in the world, they faced other challenges, and this caused the first wave movements to progress a little slower or to stop, and they remained in the background.
I mean, of course, the First World War was not a war that only affected the Ottoman Empire. I mean, 1 million people died. I mean, for some reason, I think we have not sufficiently realized the importance of the First World War, because on the 100th anniversary, there were very big meetings all over the world. This issue was revisited and so on. Various things were done in our country as well, but I think we have a romantic view of history. We have a deficiency stemming from that. After all, it affected the whole world. It changed the balances all over the world. The seeds of World War II were sown and many other things happened. The women's movement always declines a little in wars anyway. On the one hand, something like this happens. When men go to the front during wars, women are transferred to factories or work areas for men because they are empty. This happened in the West, for example, in World War I and World War II. But when the war is over, women are asked to return home and have children to replace the men who were lost in that war. This already causes chaos. But in the end, when a right is gained, it is not easy to go back. In other words, it continues from there. Let me say that.
Let's say I hope we continue like this, sir.
I hope so.
So, did the women's movement continue after this war? How do we see this when we look at Turkey?
She tried to continue. In other words, the women's movement actually supported the establishment of the Republic of Turkey and had high hopes. In fact, the first political party founded in Turkey was a political party founded by women. And in the program of this political party, they were even committed to doing military service. In other words, as long as they are treated equally with men, they should have the right to be elected. You know, let them also enter politics. However, no response was given to this petition to establish a party for 8 months, and newspapers published some things that belittled or insulted this demand or made fun of this demand. There were discussions about this in the parliament as well. The women's first attempts to establish a party were unsuccessful, but an association was established. The Turkish Women's Union still continues today, but in fact, the women's movement somehow emerged from the hands of women. The elites of the newly founded Republic of Turkey fell below their enthusiasm to produce new model women. Let me put it that way. In other words, women continued to gain. But this was something that was at the initiative of the elites of the Republic. Women became passive here.
So it remained a limited and circumscribed struggle.
In other words, that struggle, the struggle carried out by women themselves, has ended. I can end by saying that the struggle has changed hands.
Okay, teacher, thank you very much for your valuable comments. In fact, we have drawn a general framework. We have examined the process in the world and in the Ottoman Empire until today in general. Thank you very much for your valuable comments.
It's nothing, God forgive me.
Dear viewers, today we talked about the women's issue as a historical and social issue. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.